Well, on today's XBSS governance video, I'm excited to have Brother Art Caliman here to join us. We're going to talk about two topics, executive committees of the board and the executive session of the board. But before we launch into that, I do want to just give a brief introduction to Brother Art, who has been a great supporter of all things XBSS. Brother Art joined the Xaverian Brothers in 1965 after graduating from Xaverian High School in Brooklyn. After completing his undergrad and master's at Catholic University, he taught briefly and then began a career in Catholic social services and Catholic healthcare. He served in social ministries in the Catholic Diocese of Richmond and in sponsorship roles at Catholic healthcare facilities in New York, Maryland, Virginia, and Florida. He served a term as sponsorship director for XBSS in the former Central Province and as general superior for the Xaverian Brothers congregation. Brother Art has a lot of experience with our XBSS boards. He has served on 8 XBSS boards over his career, and he currently serves as chair of the members of the 13 XBSS corporations. So, Brother Art, let me know if I missed anything. Feel free to add in any other details to your bio.
Well, that's quite all right. Everything you described makes me sound extremely old in addition to experience. So thank you.
Not at all, but I'm glad to have your wisdom here. So let's start with executive committees. It's one of 2 committees that is required per the bylaws of all 13 schools in the network, the governance committee being the other committee. But just talk at a kind of high level, low level in terms of the purpose of an executive committee of one of our boards.
Sure, Patrick. As indicated specifically in the bylaws, all of our boards have executive committees, are required to have executive committees. And the purpose of an executive committee, if needed, is to act on behalf of the board. That language is very important. The executive committee is there, if needed, to act on behalf of the board, not to act instead of the board, not to act on its own or on behalf of itself, but always on behalf of the full board. I would say in terms of trends, as you mentioned, different types of boards. There are some boards, not in our case, but there are some boards like hospital boards that meet quite frequently, such as once a month because they are required by state law for the credentialing of physicians, for example. When a board meets, a full board meets every month, there's less and less need for anybody to take action between meetings. And I would say most recently in a lot of organizations, including our own, the need for an executive committee meeting for unexpected agenda is less and less because we've gotten more used to being able to convene an unscheduled Zoom call for the full board when something comes up. But in the event that that's impossible to do, it's good to have a mechanism such as an executive committee that can act on behalf of the board between meetings. And that usually happens for 1 or 2 reasons. One is a specific action or the final motion on an action is delegated by the full board to the executive committee to follow up on and just kind of close the loop on something that requires board approval. So for example, if a board has been considering a transaction involving debt, taking on a loan, taking on debt as part of a capital project, the board may have gone through the entire letter of intent, the details of the proposal, but the proposal itself is still in process and still being edited, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not going to change dramatically. However, for closing documents, there has to be a board resolution approving the final draft. So a board that might meet and approve in concept, the debt, et cetera, some of the details, can delegate to its executive committee the approval of the final draft as long as it doesn't change materially from what the board has already discussed. That's a clear case in which the full board gives the executive committee a specific task to follow up on. The other thing that can occur, as I say, is probably happening less often these days, but the other situation that can occur is an issue comes up that requires board approval or board action with a relatively tight time frame, and it's not feasible to convene a full board meeting in a relatively short period of time. The executive committee, in that case, can act on behalf of the board as long as they follow certain procedures. An example of that might be early on in the pandemic when there were certain federal funds available to support private schools like ours. Some schools became aware of their eligibility for some of that money at the very last minute, so to speak, because they were alerted by a professional association or their auditing firm that you may be able to get X amount of dollars to cover certain costs, but you have to have an application submitted by December 31st, and it has to include a resolution of your board authorizing the application. Well, again, if that comes up 3 or 4 weeks before the end of the calendar year, trying to convene a board meeting between then and Christmas might just not be reasonable. So something like that might be handled by the executive committee. But in cases like that, and in general, it's always crucial that the executive committee have timely and consistent communication with the full board, especially if it's an agenda item that the board was not aware of when they last met. So that a board chair typically would contact the whole board and say, here's the issue that's come up. The executive committee is going to take action on this before December 31. If you have any key concerns, let us know before then. But the full board should be aware of what the executive committee is doing. So the executive committee should not be setting its own agenda. It should be either delegated from the board or come up because of a reason like that that's unanticipated. And in terms of the composition, like, who is the executive committee? A couple of factors are important. One is the bylaws don't describe in great detail who should be on the executive committee, other than giving a minimum number. Should be 5 or more trustees or directors, and should include the president and the chairman. Now, the only real, I think, important criteria is to make sure that as the executive committee is fleshed out for a given board, it includes a variety of perspectives and experiences and opinions and backgrounds. So we would not, for example, want an executive committee of 5 board members, all of whom are high-powered bankers and lawyers, and nobody knows anything about education. Or conversely, 5 highly skilled educators, none of whom can add. So you want a variety of perspectives. A lot of boards manage to do that by simply having a practice that the committee chairs or make up the executive committee. That would be fine. Sometimes that's too large a group. If the board has 6 or 7 standing committees, you might not want 6 or 7 executive committee members in addition to the president and the chairman of the board. But the point there is to have a variety of inputs when the executive committee has to meet. And again, some schools do it by saying, okay, we want a representative or somebody from each of the main committees. It may or may not be the chairman of every committee, but again, it's up to each board to decide what that composition is. But again, diversity of the people around the table is important. But related to that are, some of the cautions about executive committees, one of which is there should not be a group that meets routinely. The executive committee should meet for those specific purposes that are either delegated by the board or come up between board meetings and have to be acted upon. So the executive committee should not have regularly scheduled monthly meetings or bi-monthly meetings or whatever, because the risk with that, if the executive committee meets too frequently, takes on too much responsibility, is it can become like a mini board, and it can lead into a board culture where you have an in-group and an out-group, and the people on the executive committee are perceived as the in-group who really know what's going on and make all the big decisions, and then the rest of us come together 3 or 4 times a year and they tell us what they did. That's not the purpose of the executive committee. The purpose of the executive committee is pretty constrained. I sometimes like to say in these kinds of conversations, the executive committee reminds me of like the emergency brake on an automatic transmission car. You have to have it, it's required. You may need to use it when you really need to use it. Parking on a steep incline, you're glad you have it, but it's not something that you use every time you step into your car. So I think when you look back on the function of our executive committees in the course of, say, a year, I think we want to be careful to say, have we maintained the discipline of keeping the executive committee on the side until we absolutely need it for some appropriate reason.
Excellent. Yeah, I just want to echo a couple points that you made in terms of membership on that committee. I think a lot of our schools do seem to put the chairs of each subcommittee as a member of the executive. Not that that has, is a be all end all method, but that is pretty common in the network, I think, in terms of bringing that diversity that you spoke to. And I'm glad you made the point about too. It's not, the executive committee is not a board within the board or a micro board that works in exclusion of the rest of the board. So I think that's a great point, just for me to reiterate and echo that you made, that they do work on behalf of the full board and need to keep the full board quite informed. If I could maybe just give one other example in terms of the purpose of the executive committee, talk about your thoughts on, say, things like evaluation of the head of school or compensation for the head of school. Some boards might take the approach of forming an ad hoc committee to tackle those, but it also could be within the scope of the executive committee, depending upon variables, to take those responsibilities on.
Yeah, and that's a good example of an issue that a board might have to deal with, wants to have some subgroup that processes an important issue like that ahead of time, and again, would like a subgroup that represents a variety of perspectives among board members. So if they have an executive committee, that's an appropriate use of the executive committee, but it's important to say, in a situation like that, the executive committee would not act. In that case, the executive committee is preparing and teeing up a summary of, let's say, head of school evaluations for the full board to act on. That's not the kind of thing that should be delegated to the executive committee. They should put feedback together, package it in a way that's reasonable, and present it to the full board. That's not something that would pop up at the last minute, and the executive committee has to be convened to act on this. They shouldn't be acting on something like that. That's a planned agenda. And again, that should be fairly infrequent. That's a once a year occurrence, perhaps, or once every several years, contract renewal time, et cetera, et cetera. There's also another thing that comes up, Patrick, and it's a different use of an executive committee, and it's not technically an executive committee function. Many times at the head of school, in preparation for some major decision, whether it's a capital campaign or whatever, some significant agenda that's going to come to the board, he or she might want to just get some feedback from key board leaders. And if they have an executive committee, especially if it includes all the committee chairs, he or she might ask for an executive committee meeting to go over such and such an issue, just to give him our feedback. But I would say that's not truly an executive committee meeting. They're not taking action. They're just giving advice as requested to the head of school. So he's kind of using them as a kitchen cabinet. But I think you want to be, I always get nervous when I see minutes or agendas of a school board that every meeting has an executive committee report. The executive committee has met once or more between every board meeting. That's not a good sign.
Very good. Appreciate that example. Let me pivot now to executive session. And I want to clarify that the two are not the same: executive committee, executive session, even though they share that term. And why I want to bring this up, I do recall a few board meetings in our network where I've seen some newer board directors get up and start walking out at an executive session because they were under the impression that was a meeting of the executive committee. So let's just clarify, what is executive session? What's the purpose of it? How should it be used?
Okay, well, going back to the confusion between the two items that share a common adjective, unlike the executive committee, the executive session is something that should be relatively routine for our boards. It's not called out in the bylaws, but it is a common practice, probably best practice in terms of nonprofit governance, to have some routine executive session for the board, presumably at least at most meetings, or most often at every meeting, there's some opportunity for an executive session. Executive session is typically one of two things, or both. Usually happens kind of back to back, but towards the end of a meeting, the chair declares an executive session, and the first part of the executive session is everyone's invited to leave except the actual members of the board, the trustees or directors, which includes the president. So that first part is an opportunity, without other staff members being present in the room, for a president or head of school to talk candidly to the full board about any concerns they might have or issues they might want to share that are of a confidential nature that haven't been made known yet to the entire leadership team. So they want to, a head of school wants to have conversation around that issue with the full board, make them aware without having the rest of his administrators sitting around the table. Might be an opportunity for him to share some concerns, either positive or negative, about senior executive staff, especially if they're relatively new. And he wants to inform the board that he's concerned about so-and-so and still not a person that's not yet fully tested in that role, or conversely, somebody that's relatively new, but he's quite pleased with. And then an opportunity in the other direction for board members, without all the named people being around the table, to say to a head of school, you know, I have some concerns about the chief financial officer, or I have some concerns about the new principal or whatever, or our committee has been very impressed with so-and-so. So to have an honest conversation like that between board members and the head of school is obviously going to be much more comfortable and much more candid if it's done without any of those people sitting in the room. And then the other component of an executive session, or the other form of executive session, is when the full board meets without the president or head of school there. And the purpose of that kind of a session is specifically so the board has an opportunity, again, without pressure, in a comfortable fashion, to share some thoughts about things related to the performance of the head of school without having him or her there to hear that, or to have to respond to anything. Again, because of the sensitivity of these kinds of sessions, a couple of things are important. One is, as I say, executive sessions should be fairly routine. When an executive session is permissible or allowable, but hardly ever happens, when you really need to have one because of some concern about the head of school or some concern about the rest of the leadership team, and somebody calls for an executive session, that's very jarring for people who are not used to that. So the purpose of having routine executive sessions is that when you really need them, it's not going to shake the trees too much, so to speak. So it doesn't get people nervous because they, you know, somebody asked for an executive session and what's behind that, what's going on. Now we sometimes get into the situation because of that, where we know it's important to make executive session routine, but there's nothing to talk about. So the regular board meeting comes to an end. Everybody leaves except the president. The president says, I don't have anything I really need to share. That's fine. You know, he or she can leave at that point. The board members can say, you know, anybody have any concerns or anything they want to bring up? If the answer is no, talk about football for 10 minutes. You know, do something for 10 minutes. Don't just cancel the executive session. And above all, don't come to the end of the regular board meeting and a board chair, in all sincerity, sometimes says, you know, does anybody see the need for an executive session? Well, hardly anybody's going to say yes, or if somebody does say yes, then everybody in the room looks at him or her, and then everybody who has to leave the room stands outside saying, what do you think he or she, why do they think there should be an executive session? So long story short is, the more routine that becomes, the more comfortable it becomes, and the less traumatic it is when you have a heavy issue to deal with in executive session. But I think the other things about executive session, I would say there's three things. Executive session should be routine. Secondly, they need to be disciplined. And then thirdly, they need to be respectful. Okay, and the second thing, when I say they need to be disciplined, I mean the executive session conversation needs to be about the performance of the chief executive, or about something that the rest of the people who left the room can't be a part of. If the conversation is about routine things, just an extension of the board meeting, that's not the purpose of executive session, and it's a negative dynamic. Even if it's an interesting issue that somebody brings up, if it's not something that needs to be discussed in executive session, then it shouldn't be discussed there. So for example, sometimes an issue comes out of left field. So, you know, can adjourn the regular board meeting, went to executive session, and then somebody says, you know, we had that discussion of the long-range capital plan, and it occurred to me that we're not giving any resources into redoing the main entrance to the school. That's our front door. It's really important. That's when parents come in, even if the kids and the faculty don't, you know, it's really important. Well, that may be an important observation. It's not something that you should be that you need to discuss in executive session. And very often somebody will bring up something from the main part of the board meeting, and it's a question that only the president has the answer to, and he or she is the one that was just sent out of the room. So why are we asking an executive session? Has the school done anything in regard to reaching out to other markets that we have no experience with to partly to address the enrollment problem? Well, again, good question, but you should ask the president and other members of the senior staff that question so they can answer it. So the mechanism to keep the executive session on-focused and disciplined is, typically the chair saying politely, that's an important point, we'll follow up with that, but we don't need to be dealing with that in executive session. A lot of times a board chair trying to manage the whole dynamic may or may not stay on top of that, but it's perfectly fine for anybody else on the board to, raise the point of, excuse me, I think this is an interesting question, but is there a reason we need to be discussing this in executive session? So, anybody on the board and all of us together on a board should be responsible for, raising our hands to say, stop the line. This is, we're off track here and we need to stay on track. And that relates to my third concern about executive session sometimes, is that it needs to be respectful of the people that have to leave the room. I mean, that's in a high-powered organization like most of our schools, when you ask somebody to leave so we can talk about them or talk about things they don't know about, that can be a stressful situation. So the timing, the length of time of an executive session, not when it's planned, like the annual evaluation of a president or annual review of compensation, the routine executive session, if it goes on for 15 minutes, the president who just left the room is curious about what people are saying. If it's 30 minutes or more, the president or head of school is anxious. When it's an hour or more, that's when the excluded person is verging on panic. So the dynamic and part of the discipline is to everybody in the executive session to be sensitive to the fact that somebody that just left the room is very anxious about what we're discussing, and he or she assumes we've discussed nothing except his or her performance since they left. So if we spent 20 minutes talking about the football coach, that's not an executive session item, and it's not respectful of the person that we've excluded to let the conversation go on with a topic like that doesn't belong in executive session. And the other point about being respectful of the people that are excluded is to have some, as early as possible, follow-up conversation, usually between the board chair and the head of school, saying, the executive session went on for 20 minutes, but other than some kind of chit chat, there was nothing substantive, or there were some substantive things, without saying who said what, which defeats the purpose of an executive session, without applying names to any of the conversation, to say there are a couple of concerns that you should be aware of, A and B, but that shouldn't wait for 30 days after the board meeting and the executive session. So I think that's those are kind of key points about executive sessions. So again, unlike executive committees, they're good to have as a routine, but they've got to be conducted in a way that's reasonable and disciplined.
Excellent. I think you hit upon all the key points there. I would say the one that you talked about, which I see probably most prevalent when it occurs, is our boards can have a tendency sometimes to gravitate back to discussion from the meeting. And it's, I always remind boards, you have to think about in your head, should the president be privy to this or be a part of this conversation? And again, I think a lot of times, as you mentioned, it's on the board chair to kind of rein that in if the conversation does weave back into the business. But that probably is the one area I think most boards just need to be conscientious of in terms of making sure that the focus is on the president and not on topics from the business earlier in the day. So appreciate everything you have shared with us, Brother Art. So again, if any folks are looking for more information on executive committees or executive session, just reach out to the office. Thanks again, Brother Art. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Patrick.